The Mississippi River stretched like a muddy serpent beneath the morning mist of May 18, 1863, carrying with it the hopes and fears of a divided nation. From the bluffs of Vicksburg, Confederate General John Clifford Pemberton gazed down at the approaching Union fleet, knowing that the fate of the Confederacy itself might well be decided in the coming weeks. Along these very banks, Major General Ulysses Simpson Grant had already proven himself a formidable opponent, but Pemberton felt confident in his position. Vicksburg sat 200 feet above the river on towering bluffs, its artillery commanding every vessel that dared pass. The city had earned its nickname as the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. Through months of successful resistance against Union naval attacks, now, with nearly 30,000 Confederate troops manning the defenses, Pemberton believed his fortress could withstand whatever Grant might attempt. The morning air carried the distant sound of steamboat whistles as Grant's massive army approached from multiple directions. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Lockett, Pemberton's chief engineer, had spent months preparing the city's defenses. A series of interconnected forts, redoubts, and rifle pits formed a defensive arc stretching from the river north of the city to the river south of it, creating what military historians would later call one of the most formidable defensive positions of the entire war. As reported in contemporary accounts from Harper's Weekly, the strategic importance of Vicksburg could not be overstated in the minds of both Union and Confederate leadership. President Abraham Lincoln himself had declared that Vicksburg is the key to Union victory, understanding that control of the Mississippi River would effectively split the Confederacy in two and open vital supply lines for Union forces within the city's limits. Civilians prepared for what many hoped would be another failed Union assault. Martha Vick, whose family had founded the town, gathered her household servants and prepared the family's cave refuge. Like many of Vicksburg's residents, she had learned from previous bombardments that the natural caves carved into the city's bluffs offered the best protection from enemy artillery. Confederate soldiers moved through their positions with practiced efficiency, checking ammunition supplies and reinforcing earthworks that had been under construction for months. Private James Wilson of the 3rd Louisiana Infantry wrote in his diary that morning about the fine spirits of the men. Despite growing concerns about supply shortages that had begun affecting the garrison, Grant's army had already demonstrated its capability through victories at Port Gibson and Champion Hill, forcing Pemberton's forces back toward their final defensive position. The Union commander understood that a direct assault against such well-prepared defenses would be costly, but he also knew that time might be working against him. Confederate General Joseph Eggleston Johnston was reportedly gathering forces to relieve Vicksburg, making a prolonged campaign risky for Union forces. The stage was set for a siege that would revolutionize military tactics in America. Neither Grant nor Pemberton fully understood on that May morning how the coming weeks would transform the nature of warfare itself, introducing techniques of entrenchment, sapping, and systematic starvation that would become hallmarks of later conflicts. The citizens of Vicksburg, both military and civilian, were about to endure an ordeal that would test the very limits of human endurance and reshape the course of American history. By the first week of June 1863, the reality of siege warfare had settled over Vicksburg like a suffocating blanket. Grant's forces, numbering over 70,000 men, had completely encircled the Confederate stronghold, transforming the once bustling river port into an isolated island of resistance. The Union commander had learned from his costly frontal assaults in May that Vicksburg would not fall to brute force. Alone, Lieutenant General John Alexander McClernand's 13th Corps held the Union left flank, while Major General James Birdseye McPherson's 17th Corps controlled the center, and Major General William Tecumseh Sherman's 15th Corps anchored the right. This massive force had constructed their own network of trenches, parallels, and approaches that crept ever closer to the Confederate lines with each passing day. The transformation of the landscape around Vicksburg was remarkable to behold. What had once been rolling farmland and quiet neighborhoods now resembled a vast construction site of military engineering. Union soldiers worked around the clock, digging zigzag approaches called saps that allowed them to advance toward Confederate positions while remaining protected from enemy fire. The sound of picks and shovels had become as constant as the periodic crack of sniper rifles. Confederate engineer Samuel Lockett responded to each Union advance with countermeasures of his own. His men dug counter approaches and placed explosive devices called torpedoes in the path of advancing Union sappers. The deadly game of military engineering had become a chess match played out in dirt and timber, with each side trying to anticipate and counter the other's moves, according to military correspondence preserved in the official records of the war. Of the rebellion, the siege had quickly evolved into something unprecedented in American military experience. Both armies were learning siege warfare techniques that had been refined in European conflicts, but never before applied on such a scale in the New World. Inside Vicksburg, the civilian population began to feel the first serious effects of the blockade. Food prices soared as supplies dwindled. Marion Lowborough, a resident who kept a detailed diary of the siege, wrote of having to pay exorbitant prices for basic necessities. A pound of bacon that had cost 12.5 cents before the siege now commanded to $1.50 when it could be found at all. The psychological impact of constant bombardment proved as challenging as the physical privations. Union artillery batteries, positioned on the Louisiana shore, across the river, and in land-based positions surrounding the city, maintained an almost continuous barrage. Residents learned to distinguish between different types of incoming shells by their sound. The heavy mortars produced a distinctive whistle that gave families just enough time to seek shelter in their caves. Confederate morale remained surprisingly high despite these hardships. Pemberton's men understood the strategic importance of their position and took pride in their ability to frustrate Grant's much larger army. Soldiers shared rations with civilian families and maintained their positions with remarkable discipline. Evening entertainments, including musical performances and storytelling, helped maintain spirits during the darkest hours. Yet beneath this surface determination, practical concerns grew more pressing each day. Ammunition supplies, while still adequate, required careful rationing. Medical supplies grew scarce, making treatment of wounded soldiers increasingly difficult. Most critically, food reserves that had seemed sufficient for a short siege now appeared inadequate for what was clearly becoming an extended ordeal. The stage was being set for a test of endurance that would push both military and civilian populations to their absolute limits. The third week of June 1863 brought an ominous new dimension to the siege of Vicksburg as Union engineers began their most ambitious project yet, mining operations designed to literally blow holes in the Confederate defenses. Colonel Andrew Hickenlooper of the 5th Ohio Independent Battery, working under the direction of Captain Andrew Hickenlooper, had identified a promising location near the 3rd Louisiana Redan, where Union trenches had advanced to within 50 yards of Confederate positions. The mining operation represented a return to medieval siege tactics, updated with modern explosives. Union soldiers, many of whom had worked as miners in civilian life, began excavating a tunnel that would extend beneath the Confederate fortifications. Working in shifts around the clock, these underground warriors faced dangers that their comrades in the trenches above could scarcely imagine. Cave-ins, flooding, and the constant threat of Confederate counter-mining made every hour below ground a test of courage. Private Henry Ginder of the 45th Illinois Infantry volunteered for mining duty despite having no previous experience with underground work. His letters home, later published in local newspapers, described the claustrophobic conditions and constant fear that dominated life in the tunnels. The air grew thick and difficult to breathe as the miners worked deeper into the earth. Candles frequently guttered out, leaving men working in absolute darkness guided only by touch and whispered instructions. Confederate defenders, aware of the Union mining efforts through the vibrations and sounds that carried through the earth, began their own counter-mining operations. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Lockett organized teams of soldiers to dig shafts designed to intercept the Union tunnels. This underground warfare created a three-dimensional battlefield, where combat might erupt at any moment beneath the feet of soldiers fighting in trenches above. As documented in contemporary engineering reports, the technical challenges of siege mining in the Mississippi soil proved formidable. The lowest soil of the Vicksburg Bluffs, while excellent for creating defensive positions, tended to collapse without proper timbering. Both Union and Confederate miners became expert at creating underground galleries supported by wooden frameworks that could withstand the weight of earth above while providing working space below. Above ground, the siege continued its relentless progression. Union artillery had refined their targeting to focus on specific objectives within the city. The courthouse, serving as both a symbol of Confederate authority and a convenient observation post, drew particular attention from Union gunners. Citizens learned to time their movements between bombardments, dashing from building to building during brief lulls in the shelling. Food shortages had progressed from inconvenience to genuine hardship. Families that had once enjoyed comfortable middle-class lives now found themselves competing for scraps of bread and watered-down soup. The city's restaurants had closed. Their owners either fled or reduced to the same desperate circumstances as their former customers. Gardens that had once produced flowers now yielded vegetables, though even these were frequently damaged by shell fragments. Confederate soldiers demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. In extending their food supplies, they learned to prepare dishes from materials that would have been considered inedible under normal circumstances. Rats, which had become numerous in the city's ruins, found their way into cooking pots alongside dandelions and other forage plants. Water, drawn from the Mississippi under cover of darkness, had to be carefully filtered to remove the taste of mud and debris. The siege had entered a phase where both sides understood that victory would ultimately belong to whichever force could endure longer. Grant's army enjoyed the advantage of regular supplies from Union-controlled territory, while Pemberton's forces drew upon reserves that diminished with each passing day. Yet the Confederate commander still hoped that General Johnston's relief expedition might break the Union encirclement before Starvation forced a surrender. June 25, 1863, dawned clear and hot, with no indication that this day would witness one of the most dramatic moments of the entire Vicksburg siege. For over a week, Union miners had been packing 2,200 pounds of black powder into a chamber they had excavated beneath the 3rd Louisiana Redan. Colonel Andrew Hickenlooper made final preparations for the explosion that would, he hoped, create a breach large enough for Union infantry to storm through Confederate defenses. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, the earth beneath Vicksburg erupted in a thunderous explosion that could be heard for miles along the Mississippi River. A massive column of dirt, timber, artillery pieces, and human bodies shot skyward like a volcanic eruption, creating a crater 30 feet deep and 50 feet across. The blast killed and wounded dozens of Confederate soldiers, including members of the 3rd Louisiana Infantry who had been manning the Redan. Union forces, positioned in their forward trenches and ready to exploit the breakthrough, charged toward the smoking crater with fixed bayonets and triumphant shouts. However, the explosion had created an unexpected tactical problem. Instead of opening a clear path through Confederate defenses, the blast had created a deep hole that proved difficult to cross under fire. Confederate reserves, quickly reorganized under the leadership of Brigadier General Lewis Hebert, rushed to defend the breach from positions around the crater's rim. What followed was some of the most intense close-quarters combat of the entire siege. Union soldiers found themselves trapped in the crater, unable to advance further, but also unable to retreat under the heavy Confederate fire that poured down from the surrounding positions. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted as Confederate soldiers threw hand grenades into the crater while Union troops tried desperately to establish footholds on the crater's edge. According to battlefield reports later compiled by military historians, the fighting around the crater continued for 26 hours without pause. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage, and casualties mounted steadily as fresh troops were fed into the meat grinder of close combat. The crater, intended to provide Union forces with a breakthrough, had instead become a deadly trap that consumed soldiers from both armies. Private William Tunnard of the 3rd Louisiana Infantry, one of the survivors of the initial explosion, later wrote about the surreal experience of fighting in and around the crater. The landscape had been transformed into something resembling descriptions of hell itself. The earth was torn and blackened, filled with the debris of war and the bodies of fallen soldiers. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the stench of death created an atmosphere that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Confederate morale, initially shaken by the dramatic explosion, recovered as their forces successfully contained the Union breakthrough attempt. Soldiers who had witnessed the devastating blast and lived to tell about it developed an almost superstitious confidence in their ability to withstand whatever Grant's army might attempt next. The successful defense of the crater became a source of pride that helped sustain Confederate resistance through the increasingly difficult weeks that followed. The failure of the mining operation forced Grant to reconsider his tactical approach to breaking the Vicksburg defenses. Direct assault had proven too costly, and even sophisticated engineering projects like the mine had failed to achieve decisive results. The Union commander increasingly recognized that time and patience might prove more effective than any tactical innovation. The siege would continue, but its character would shift toward a more systematic campaign of attrition. inside Vicksburg. The explosion and subsequent battle had demonstrated both the vulnerability and the resilience of the Confederate position. While Union forces had proven capable of extraordinary engineering feats, they had also shown that they could be stopped by determined resistance and quick thinking. Yet the defenders also understood that each such crisis depleted their limited reserves of men and materials, bringing them closer to the moment when continued resistance might become impossible. By the second week of July 1863, the siege of Vicksburg had transformed the city into a landscape that resembled ancient cave dwellings more than a modern American town. Nearly the entire civilian population had abandoned their homes for crude shelters carved into the lowest bluffs that surrounded the city. These caves, initially intended as temporary refuges during bombardments, had become permanent residences for families driven underground by the relentless Union artillery. Marion Loughborough, whose cave diary would later become one of the most important first-hand accounts of the siege, described the strange society that had developed in these subterranean refuges. Families that had once lived in elegant mansions now shared cramped spaces with their servants, former social distinctions, temporarily abandoned in the face of shared hardship. Children played games in the dim candlelight, while their mothers tried to maintain some semblance of normal domestic life. In utterly abnormal circumstances, the caves themselves varied dramatically in size and comfort depending on the resources and determination of their inhabitants. Wealthy families like the Vicks had excavated elaborate multi-room complexes, complete with furniture salvaged from their damaged homes. Poorer residents made do with simple holes in the hillside, furnished with nothing more than blankets and whatever household items they had managed to save from the bombardment. Ventilation presented a constant challenge in these underground dwellings. The natural properties of lowest soil made excavation relatively easy, but the same characteristics that allowed for quick digging also made cave-ins a constant threat. Families learned to reinforce their shelters with timber salvaged from destroyed buildings, creating an underground architecture that combined desperation with ingenuity. According to contemporary medical reports preserved in Confederate archives, the cave life had serious health consequences for the civilian population. The lack of sunlight and fresh air contributed to various ailments, while overcrowding facilitated the spread of diseases. Children, particularly vulnerable to these conditions, suffered from malnutrition that was compounded by the psychological stress of their underground existence. Food had become the central obsession of daily life in besieged Vicksburg. Families that had once taken meals for granted now spent their days in desperate searches for anything edible. The city's cats and dogs had long since disappeared into cooking pots, followed by rats, which commanded premium prices in the strange economy of starvation. Enterprising individuals discovered that the bark of certain trees could be ground into a flour substitute, though the resulting bread bore little resemblance to the product the name had once described. Confederate soldiers continued to share their rations with civilian families, though their own supplies had dwindled to dangerous levels. A full ration, which had once consisted of substantial portions of meat, bread, and vegetables, now consisted of a few ounces of cornmeal and whatever protein could be found or foraged. Salt, essential for preserving what little meat remained available, had become so scarce that soldiers carefully saved and reused every grain. The psychological impact of prolonged starvation began to manifest itself in various ways. Throughout the besieged city, previously mild-mannered citizens engaged in fierce arguments over scraps of food. Children who had once played elaborate games now spent their time in listless exhaustion, their energy sapped by inadequate nutrition. Adults found themselves obsessing over memories of meals they had enjoyed before the siege, creating elaborate mental menus of foods they might never taste again. Yet despite these hardships, the spirit of resistance remained surprisingly strong. Among both military and civilian populations, evening gatherings in the larger caves featured musical performances, storytelling, and discussions of literature that provided psychological refuge from the harsh realities of daily life. These cultural activities, maintained despite extreme adversity, demonstrated the determination of Vicksburg's defenders to preserve their humanity. Even under the most dehumanizing circumstances, Confederate military leadership worked desperately to maintain discipline and morale among troops who were increasingly focused on their empty stomachs rather than their military duties. Officers shared the same meager rations as their men, creating a sense of shared sacrifice that helped prevent the complete breakdown of military order. Yet Pemberton and his subordinates understood that even the most disciplined army could not fight indefinitely without adequate food and supplies. July 1st, 1863, marked the beginning of what would prove to be the final week of the Vicksburg siege. Though neither defenders nor attackers yet realized how close the end had become, General Pemberton faced the most difficult decision of his military career as he surveyed reports from his subordinate commanders that painted an increasingly desperate picture of Confederate capabilities. Ammunition reserves had fallen to critical levels, with some artillery batteries reduced to fewer than 10 rounds per gun. The condition of Confederate soldiers had deteriorated dramatically. Over the past weeks, medical officers reported widespread symptoms of malnutrition among the troops, with many men too weak to perform normal military duties. Private James Wilson of the 3rd Louisiana Infantry wrote in his final diary entry about comrades who had collapsed at their posts, unable to continue standing guard after days without adequate food. The proud army that had once confidently manned Vicksburg's defenses had been reduced to a force that survived on determination alone. Inside the city, civilian suffering had reached levels that challenged the limits of human endurance. Martha, Vick, whose family had founded the town, made the painful decision to approach Confederate authorities about the possibility of surrender. Her visit to General Pemberton's headquarters reflected the desperation of a population that had exhausted every resource and strategy for survival. Children were dying of starvation, and the elderly could no longer endure the privations of cave life. Union forces, aware of the deteriorating conditions within Vicksburg through deserters and intelligence reports, prepared for what they hoped would be the final phase of the siege. Grant had received intelligence suggesting that Confederate morale was finally beginning to crack, with increasing numbers of soldiers abandoning their posts under cover of darkness. Yet the Union commander remained cautious, understanding that desperate defenders might still be capable of inflicting heavy casualties on attacking forces. The contrast between conditions inside and outside the Confederate lines had become stark beyond imagination. Union soldiers, supplied by a steady stream of steamboats from the north, enjoyed adequate rations and regular mail delivery from home. Medical supplies remained sufficient to treat wounded soldiers properly, and morale stayed high despite the frustration of the prolonged siege. Grant's army had become a well-supplied force conducting operations against an enemy that was slowly starving to death. On July 3rd, General Pemberton made the agonizing decision to open negotiations for the surrender of Vicksburg. He sent a message to Grant under a flag of truce, requesting terms for the capitulation of the Confederate garrison. The decision came after consultations with his senior officers, who unanimously agreed that continued resistance had become impossible, given their desperate supply situation and the deteriorating condition of both soldiers and civilians. The surrender negotiations took place in a surreal atmosphere, with the two commanding generals meeting between their respective lines, while their armies maintained their positions. Grant, magnanimous in victory, offered terms that allowed Confederate soldiers to return home on parole, rather than face imprisonment. This generous offer reflected both practical considerations about managing large numbers of prisoners and Grant's understanding that healing the nation's wounds would require treating defeated enemies with dignity, as reported in contemporary newspaper accounts, including detailed coverage in the New York Tribune. The surrender negotiations revealed the extent of suffering within the besieged city. Union officers who entered Vicksburg during the truce talks were shocked by the conditions they observed. Buildings had been reduced to rubble, streets were filled with debris from months of bombardment, and the civilian population showed clear signs of severe malnutrition. Confederate soldiers prepared for surrender with a mixture of relief and shame that would haunt many of them for the rest of their lives. They had maintained their positions and discipline under circumstances that tested the limits of human endurance, yet the reality of defeat was bitter to accept. Many units destroyed their battle flags rather than surrender them to Union forces, preserving their honor even in capitulation. The formal surrender ceremony was scheduled for July 4th, 1863, a date that would carry special significance for both Union forces celebrating their victory and Confederate defenders acknowledging their defeat. As news of the impending surrender spread through both armies, soldiers on both sides began to contemplate the end of a siege that had transformed their understanding of warfare and tested their capacity for both inflicting and enduring suffering. July 4th, 1863, dawned with an eerie silence that seemed unnatural after 47 days of constant bombardment and gunfire. At 10 o'clock in the morning, A white flag appeared above the Confederate works, signaling the formal surrender of Vicksburg to Union forces. General John Clifford Pemberton, accompanied by his staff officers, rode out to meet General Ulysses Simpson Grant and formally transfer control of the city. That had been called the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. The surrender ceremony itself was conducted with dignity and respect that reflected the professional relationship between the opposing commanders. Grant, understanding the symbolic importance of the moment, accepted Pemberton's sword in a brief ceremony, before immediately returning it as a gesture of respect for his opponent's courage. During the long siege, the Union commander's magnanimous behavior set the tone for the occupation that would follow, preventing the kind of vindictive treatment that might have further embittered the defeated population. Confederate soldiers, many of whom had not eaten a full meal in weeks, were amazed by the generosity of their Union counterparts. Federal troops shared their rations with hungry Confederate prisoners, demonstrating a humanity that transcended the political divisions that had brought them to war. Private William Tunnard of the 3rd Louisiana Infantry later wrote about the kindness shown by Union soldiers who understood that their enemies had fought with courage and honor. Despite their ultimate defeat, the civilian population emerged from their caves and makeshift shelters to witness the formal end of their ordeal. Many residents, particularly children, had not seen sunlight for weeks and appeared ghostly pale as they ventured into the streets. Union medical personnel immediately began providing assistance to the most severely malnourished civilians, probably saving hundreds of lives through their prompt intervention. The strategic consequences of Vicksburg's fall became immediately apparent to military observers on both sides. The Mississippi River was now under complete Union control from its source to its mouth, effectively splitting the Confederacy in half and cutting off vital supply lines between the eastern and western Confederate states. As President Abraham Lincoln reportedly observed, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea," highlighting the strategic importance of the victory. Within hours of the surrender, Union steamboats began arriving at Vicksburg's docks, carrying supplies and reinforcements that transformed the recently besieged city into a major Union base of operations. The efficiency of this logistical operation demonstrated the industrial and organizational advantages that would ultimately prove decisive in the Union's victory over the Confederacy. For the defeated Confederate garrison, the terms of surrender proved more generous than many had dared hope. Soldiers were allowed to return home on parole, after promising not to take up arms against the United States until properly exchanged. This policy, while controversial among some Union leaders who preferred imprisonment, proved wise in beginning the process of reconciliation that would be necessary for healing the nation's wounds. After the war's end, the siege of Vicksburg had demonstrated the evolution of military tactics that would influence warfare for generations to come. The extensive use of trenches, systematic approaches, mining operations, and siege artillery presaged the kind of warfare that would dominate conflicts later in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Military engineers and tacticians would study the Vicksburg campaign for decades, drawing lessons about the conduct of siege operations under modern conditions. As documented in post-war military histories, the human cost of the siege had been enormous for both sides. Confederate casualties, including both military and civilian losses, numbered in the thousands, while Union forces had also paid a heavy price for their victory. The siege had tested the limits of human endurance and demonstrated both the destructive potential of modern warfare and the resilience of people facing extreme adversity. The fall of Vicksburg, combined with the Union victory at Gettysburg on the same day, marked the turning point of the American Civil War. The Confederacy would continue to fight for nearly 2 more years, but it would never again possess the strategic advantages or resources necessary to achieve ultimate victory. The siege had broken more than just the Confederate hold on the Mississippi River. It had broken the back of Confederate hopes for independence and set the stage for the eventual reunification of the American nation. The lessons learned in the tunnels, trenches, and caves of Vicksburg would echo through military history, but perhaps more importantly, they demonstrated the human capacity for both cruelty and compassion in the extremes of warfare. The siege had ended, but its legacy would influence American military doctrine and national memory for generations to come.